For whatever reason, anticipation is one of the more misunderstood concepts of what we do.
Anticipation?
It's huge, man. It's everything. It's everywhere. It's little tiny infinitesimal, and sometimes it's gigantic, and you see it coming a mile away.
Without it, your movement is going to be unnatural. It's going to be poppy. It's going to be jerky.
Anticipation is like something that you could forever keep learning about, I think.
Without anticipation, it doesn't look right.
Anticipation is a lot of different things.
Anticipation is setting up an action.
It's sort of like the storing and releasing of energy, the squashing and the stretching.
Anticipation is giving weight and a feeling of momentum or inertia to your character.
Probably one of the best ways to start examining the idea of anticipation is to start with the basic principle of squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is easily one of the most important principles because it is so fundamental to everything that we animate. It's fundamental to the way that we walk and the way that we move. It's fundamental to the way that you animate inanimate objects. Just one of the most basic ways you can give life to a character is through squash and stretch. Squash and stretch really truly does become a big part of the foundation that you will build your acting performances on and that you'll build your scenes on. I use it in probably every scene. Probably the clearest way to examine squash and stretch is with the bouncing ball. A bouncing ball assignment has been foundation of animation schools for the last century practically, and it's that way for a reason. You can learn so much from animating a bouncing ball or animating different bouncing balls with different weights and made of different materials, and that will teach you so much that you will always be applying to walk cycles, you'll be applying it to an acting performance, to anything. And the basic idea is if you've got a ball, a rubber ball let's say, and I throw that ball up into the air, on the way up, if I've thrown it with enough velocity, it's going to maybe start to stretch a little bit because it's going so fast. And then once it reaches the apex, the very top of that arc, it's going to kind of squash up because the top part of that ball is going to start to slow down a little bit before the bottom part of that ball. And so as the top part starts to slow down, the bottom part's still going up, and that creates a squash, like that. And then on the way back down, the bottom part of the ball, since it's lower or heavier, or I don't know, we can think about it in these terms anyway, the bottom part is going to start to fall before the top part. And slowly over time, that's going to lead into more of a stretched shape, right? And as it's coming down, its most stretched moment will be the frame just as it's touching the ground, just as it barely touches. And as soon as it hits, bam, it's going to squash, right? And the reason it's squashing is because the bottom part of that ball has hit the ground, but the top part of that ball is still rocketing downward, right? It's still falling. It hasn't hit anything yet. So it's going to want to compress down, and then if it's going to bounce back up, the bottom part's got nowhere to go. It can't move because it's stuck on the ground because the top part is squishing down on it. So the top part is going to bounce back up before the bottom part, creating another stretch. And as it goes up, it's going to squash at the apex, stretch on the way down, hit the ground, squash, stretch, lift up, and that's the basic idea of squash and stretch in a bouncing ball. Now, are there times when you wouldn't want to use squash and stretch? Sure. You know, it depends completely on the material and the weight and what you're going for. If you're going to be dropping a bowling ball onto the ground, for example, in a scene, you probably wouldn't want it to squash and stretch at all because you want that bowling ball to look very solid and very heavy. If you're doing, you know, let's say the opposite of that is a ping pong ball, where it's very light, you're still probably not going to squash and stretch a ping pong ball too much. If you do, it would be very slight. But you probably, if you want it to look like a ping pong ball, you're going to probably not have it be very squishy. You know, conversely, if you throw a water balloon and you want a water balloon kind of bouncing and sloshing around, you're going to be using squash and stretch like nobody's business. The material really can decide how much squash and stretch you're going to use.
I mean, you have to know a rule before you can break it intentionally. You know, otherwise It's like with like squash and stretch and things like that. You see people like you get a demo reel and people put squash and stretch on a bowling ball, which is perfectly fine if that's an aesthetic choice. But if you're just going like, oh well, squash and stretch is one of the 12 fundamental principles of character animation, so I need to apply it to every single thing, and then you've got to sometimes it's not appropriate, sometimes you got to bend it, sometimes you got to break it, sometimes you got to ignore it. But you don't, unless you know the rules first, you can't do it creatively or appealingly.
Okay, so I know you're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, that's really basic, I get it. You squash and stretch with bouncing balls, but how does that apply to a human movement? How does that apply to a physical performance? If I'm doing some kind of big action scene, how can I use that? The body isn't all rubbery and squishy, right? Actually, you can use that a lot, and you'll find as you progress through your kind of journey of becoming an animator that you're going to be using it all the time. One place where it's very easy to see the correlation between squash and stretch on a bouncing ball and how to apply that to a human physical performance could be in a jump. If you overlay the idea of a ball kind of bouncing along the ground, overlay that with somebody jumping, you'll see a lot of very obvious correlations. The body, for example, works just like, the overall body works just like the ball does. So let's say the ball is going to come in, let's say it's coming in at an angle, it's going to be all stretched out just as it's about to hit the ground. It hits the ground and squashes, and then it stretches out, launches back up into the air, squashes again at the top of the arc, stretches back on the way down, hits the ground and squashes, and continues on. A person jumping works just the same way. If they're going to jump, they're standing there all normal, they squish up, which is going to be them balling up, which is going to be the anticipation to the jump, which we're going to get to next. But they ball up, and then they stretch out as they go into their jump. And that last frame before a person leaves the ground, his legs are going to be like as stretched and straight as they can be, because he's launching himself up with as much force as he can muster, probably. Once he goes up in the air, he's stretching up into the air, and then as he reaches the top of that jump, the apex of that arc, he's going to squash back up, and his knees are going to come up. And the reason is because the top half of his body has stopped going up, but his feet are still going up, and that's going to cause that squash in the air. And then on the way back down, he's going to stretch back out, and the reason for that mostly is because he wants to get his feet back beneath him so he doesn't fall. And so he wants his feet out to catch him, and they'll probably be straight or very close to straight just as he hits the ground, and then he's going to squash as the weight of his body lands on his feet. And it's exactly the way a bouncing ball works. It's the exact same squash and stretch, and you'll find 100 other applications for that.
If a character's falling and then landing, like when he hits the ground, he'll squash down, but he doesn't actually have to stretch his body out. It could be like the volume as he falls, he's stretched, but as he lands, he squashes down, and his body collapses into itself, and then he stands back up. It's sort of getting that squash in there.
Another way the squash and stretch is used is in the body itself. Even though you may look at a human body and say, oh, bodies are mostly rigid, we've got a bone structure that doesn't squash around. I can't take my arm and just bend it right here, right? So if I move really fast, my arm doesn't actually bend like you might see in a wackier, more exaggerated cartoon. But doing that a little bit here and there can add so much life to your character. Specifically, you'll see a lot of squash and stretch in the face. And our faces do squash around a fair amount. Our faces are pretty malleable and squishy, and you can do a lot with your face, especially like somebody chewing maybe, especially a bigger character. The bigger you are, the squishier you get, pretty much. So if you've got a big character with great big jowls or big cheeks, and it's awesome to find ways to squish that character up, because it'll add a lot of believability to the character, even though in real life they might not squish as much as you're animating. They're going to squish a bit, especially if they're chewing gum or talking or something, or laughing.
When you're working with squash and stretch and applying those principles in a visual effects type of sense, when a dinosaur in Jurassic Park needs to jump across a screen, or the Hulk comes leaping in the frame and leaping out or crushing something, so when you refer to squash and stretch, you're not really getting a chance to really take his jowl and stretch it out, or stretch out hands and fingers like you would maybe in a traditional sense or in a make-believe environment. But what what those principles still do apply when you're taking their form of their body, and when they're going in for a landing, they're stretched out. They're completely, not completely as a board, okay? But you're creating different compression zones, right? You're expanding their legs so they're kind of stretched out when they're going into the landing, and the body, it's kind of opened up, right? And then upon impact, after it touches the next frame, it's going to be a compression frame, which you call a squash. That's sort of how we apply the principles to a different type of set of physics.
They figured out back in the 30s that this principle of squash and stretch was really beneficial to their animation. And all of those principles that they figured out all stemmed from observation, and observation of what we do as humans. And they are exaggerating what we do as humans with some of the cartoonier stuff, but it's in there. It's in there in what we do. Let's say, for example, that I'm doing a scene where some dude, for whatever reason, has a ball, and he's going to throw the ball up in the air as high as he can and then catch it. And that's the scene. Well, if that guy is really going to throw the ball, and I would get out there and I would film some reference of somebody actually doing this just to see how it works, especially when you're just starting out. Observe and film like everything, and you're going to learn so much from that. So, if that guy is really going to throw it with all the force that he can muster, and we're going to get into why this is down the line in the classes about force, physically why this happens. But what is going to happen is that guy is going to squash up to get ready to throw the ball and stretch out as he throws it. And basically all he's doing is he's using squash and stretch kind of as a means to physically get some anticipation and some strength behind his throw. So he's going to crouch way down, and he's going to ball up, which you can kind of think about as a squash. And then he's going to launch out of that, and he's going to stretch. And that big stretch launch is going to chuck that ball as high as he can get it. That's probably the best way for that guy to throw the ball upwards, is to use both arms, use the momentum from his full body, being as tucked up as he possibly can, to being as stretched out as he possibly can. And that's how you get force behind movements. A pitcher, we'll talk about it in this class. He winds up and he throws the ball, and it's a big squash, and then he stretches out when he throws it. And that's, squash and stretch really can be the key to getting some power into your scenes. Something that I find just fascinating is to look at the work of a photographer named Dr. Harold Edgerton. His photographs they're amazing. He developed a way to do ultra high speed photography with super fast flash, and he can capture literally like a millionth of a second. And if you look at his photographs, it's just stunning to see all of the different principles of animation and how they exist in this kind of finite form that you can't even normally see with the naked eye, but those principles still are there. They still exist. And all these things that we exaggerate in our work, they're all based on stuff that happens in the real world. If you check out Dr. Edgerton's photographs of like a football being kicked, football is pretty firm. You get hit in the head with a football, it hurts. Footballs, they're not that squishy. But, at a thousandth of a second, when the dude's kicking the football, it squashes way more than a lot of people would imagine it does. The one that I find really shocking is the golf ball. He's got a whole series of golfing images, and just to see how much a golf ball squashes on impact with a driver, it's shocking to me. It's like a third of it practically squashes in. One of the pictures is almost half, and it's just shocking. And it's that principle of that squash and then boom, the stretch as it takes off, and that's what gives it so much oomph. There's pictures of a softball getting squashed against a bat, far more than you think. A softball is pretty hard. I know it's called a softball, but that's a pretty hard ball. Or a tennis ball against the racket. The netting bends out a lot further than you'd think, which is totally principle of animation there. And then the ball is squished like halfway. And I know tennis balls are softer, but even so, it's still shocking to me how much that stuff really is there if you just know how to look for it. And Dr. Edgerton, he figured out a way to look for it. Check out his book, Stopping Time. It's awesome. Okay, so how does this apply to anticipation? Well, basically, squash and stretch is one of the basic fundamental principles that you're going to use when creating and designing the anticipations for your actions. If you just look at a ball, for example, just a ball, and let's say the little ball is alive, it's a living ball, but he's just sitting there, and the ball wants to leave. He wants to, like, bounce up out of there. The way that he's going to do it, if he wants to bounce, is he needs to squash out, and so that gives him somewhere to go, somewhere to stretch from. So he squashes out, and then he stretches, and he can go up that way. So he's got to come out this way. If he wants to get the brown, he's got to squash, and he needs to just squash out, and then he can bounce out, and that's where he gets that momentum from.
Getting a firm grasp of the principles of animation, but also how they apply to real life and where they came from in real life, I think can be really beneficial to your work, regardless of the style of animation you're working on.
When I think about anticipation just as in terms of a simple ball, basically if the ball just goes up, it has nothing that made it go up. It has no inertia. It has no momentum. Where does it get that momentum? Well, it gets it from anticipating, squashing down. And again, that is stretch and squash, but that squash is an anticipation to give momentum so that it can rise up. If you don't anticipate that ball that just goes up, it's like, whoa, wait, where did that come from? When you anticipate the squash down and then go up, it lets the audience know, oh, hey, something's going to happen here.
One thing that you should be able to notice right off the bat in a comparison like this is the similarities between, the basic bouncing ball and the average jump of a human being. If you just compare the hips of what Bobby's doing right now, this straight up and down jump, and compare the way that his hips are moving to the way that the ball moves, the similarities, I think, are really obvious to look at, particularly in anticipation. Bobby can't just suddenly levitate up into the air. Pay close attention to the overall movement of Bobby's hips, the up-down movement, that anticipation down before he's able to launch himself up into the air. It's that squash down where he's building the force and the energy to fire himself up into the air. And the bouncing ball works exactly the same way. The ball can't just suddenly, jump up into the air without pushing itself. It has to push itself into the air. Nothing is pulling it up. When you forget about anticipation and when you leave it out, that's when things start to look like they're being pulled into the air, or pulled up into the sky, or yanked around on a screen, rather than moving themselves around on their own volition, using their muscles and the forces within their body to actually move around.
Motion without anticipation is weak and powerless, and it doesn't have any force, and it doesn't have any weight or momentum or inertia.
Anticipation is a mechanical buildup of force. Anticipation can be used for comedic effect. Or rather, very often the lack of anticipation can be used for comedic effect.
We'll end up talking about it more in the advanced anticipation class. But, sometimes an anticipation is going to be a pause. Sometimes it's going to be a blink of an eye. Or sometimes it's going to be just a really slight, really subtle movement that just adds an extra little tiny nuance to your scene that wouldn't have existed before. It makes it just that much better, adds a little bit more entertainment value to it, a little bit more interest, a little bit more lifelike movement to your scene. So that's stuff that we're going to get into more later, how anticipation can show the thought process of what a character is going through, or how it can help sell a joke, and all those things. All that stuff is a little more advanced. For today's class, we're going to be talking more about anticipation as related to that more mechanical buildup of force, that buildup of energy, the most fundamental, the basics of anticipation, and it's important to master that stuff first.
I think Garfield said for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Was it Garfield?
Can't remember.
I can't. All right, that was underweight and overtall. I keep getting those mixed up. No, but for every action there's a reaction, pretty much. And an anticipation is what happens before the action. You can't just go forward. It'll look silly.
Very often the problem that we see in demo reels is that there is no anticipation, that things are just happening. And I've talked to students who feel like, oh, well, I don't need to use anticipation because I'm working in a more naturalistic, mode. Hey, anticipation is just for animation. That's just for cartoony. I don't need to do anticipation because I'm doing, more naturalistic motion. They feel like anticipation doesn't apply. That's crap. That's wrong. It's so wrong. We see so many demo reels where the anticipation is either neglected or used in the wrong places.
The basics absolutely apply. You will find that whether it's cartoony or realistic, the principles are there for a reason.
Even if you are doing a realistic stuff, without anticipation, it doesn't look right. Yeah, I thought it was anticipation was only in a really cartoony field, but for the real world, there is.
The more anticipation there is, the more cartoony your work is going to look. But what is really wrong is to say, well, in real life, there is no anticipation to movement.
So, you think there's no anticipation in nature? Welcome to the no anticipation zone.
We've taken live action footage and spliced out the anticipations of actions, and you'll notice two things right away. First, it's going to look totally bizarre, really poppy, and impossible. Second, you're going to notice that the actions look either weak because they don't have the anticipation, or they don't read. It's difficult to tell what's going on, especially with some of the throws. Things happen so fast that without the anticipation there, it's really difficult to tell what happened. What are you seeing? The only times in real life that there's any kind of major action without an anticipation is going to be, let's say, if somebody has a rope wrapped around their waist tied to a motorboat that takes off from the dock and it's just going to jerk them off of the dock. Or if somebody gets hit with a bat or something like that, they're just going to fall. They're not going to anticipate that fall. They're going to get hit with the bat, they're going to fall. Those outside forces, which a lot of people will call external forces, and we'll have classes about force later on where we'll talk more about this idea. But when something is an external force that's affecting the body, somebody getting punched, hit, they're getting yanked off of a board or whatever, there's not going to be anticipation for that because they're not expecting it, and their body isn't doing it of its own volition, under its own power, right? But for most movements, especially most major movements, our body is going to anticipate. And if you leave that out in your work, it's going to look like your body, your character is being affected by external forces all the time, like a marionette puppet or something like that, where it'll look like your character is IK, and there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with animating a character IK. You just need to make sure that you don't animate the character in a way that looks like, instead of reaching over for the couch, it looks like something grabbed my wrist and pulled it over to the couch, right? Yeah, it needs to look like I did it, and that's going to start in my shoulder, and it's going to probably lead with my elbow a little bit, and it's that motion that gets my hand to the couch. If my hand went to the couch like this, that's just unnatural, and there's no mechanics going on. Even though a lot of anticipations can be, extremely subtle when you're just observing real life, it's important to pay attention to them anyway and to learn about why they exist and how they work, and even on such a tiny level, why they are there in the first place.
There's all these things going on in animation, like momentum, inertia, gravity, and if you're going to do a move, then you have to get the energy somehow to do that move.
It would do a little one-frame blip before the thing. And it ended up, usually it's on like the Z, on the up and down. I would do like a little, before I go down, I do just a hair of an up. And you never see it, but you feel it. And I did an experiment. It was a Toy Story 2 because it was Buzz Lightyear. And I ripped it, I put it all in there, and then I ripped all of those out, and I A-B'd it to the recordings. And there was a definite difference. You couldn't say what it was. I would challenge anybody to say, oh, that's stereo, this is what you're doing. But you just felt it, and it just felt to me more alive. That's a trade secret right there. But it felt to me more alive. It's definitely, if I have anything in my bag of tricks, that's one of my big ones. But because it's, again, setting up this energy to do something and doing it in a way that feels more natural and less programmed.
At its heart, anticipation is a mechanical buildup of force, where you're building up these forces and energy and almost this like untapped energy that you're balling it all up and you're getting it all ready and then you're releasing it, and that release of that energy is what gets the character walking in the direction he's going to go, or it gets the ball flying in the direction that he's throwing it. You know, without anticipation, the best pitcher isn't going to be able to throw very fast. Mike Tyson couldn't punch very hard. The best soccer player in the world isn't going to be able to kick the ball very far. You can only punch so hard if you're just using the muscles in your arm. You know, boxers train like crazy to be able to, you know, punch so fast that their anticipations are lightning quick because they don't want the other guy to have a chance to react. They don't want the other guy to have a chance to see what's on the way. You know, if they're just throwing big, you know, haymakers with giant anticipations, most of those punches are going to be dodged, and they're probably going to get whooped, right? You know, it's like a pitcher. He does this big wind-up, and he gets all coiled up like, you know, really like a spring, and he's really tight, and he gets his whole body all wound up. If you're just using those muscles in your arm, it's not going anywhere. Not very quickly, anyway. If you really watch a pitcher, I mean, study a pitcher, they have like a crazy wind-up. They wind up like a spring, you know? All of a pitcher's energy gets all wound up into this giant anticipation, and then he just unwraps and uncoils and unleashes this crazy amount of force that is coming up through his hips, and it goes up through his torso, and then whips his shoulder, and then his elbow, and then finally his hand around, and it's this big, he's throwing much more from his hips and his chest than he is with his arm. You know, the arm is almost just kind of along for the ride until the very end when it whips around. And yeah, having a strong throwing arm right then really comes in handy. But most of the energy and most of the force is coming from the body. It's really hard to say, you know, what animation principles are more important than others. You can never say, oh, well, squash and stretch is the most important, or anticipation is the most important. It's like anything else in life. There's a lot of different things that come together to create one thing, in our case, one art form, right? And you have all these different principles and all these different techniques and methods and styles, but at the foundation of it all are the principles, you know? That's why they're called the principles.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the basics a lot when I do a shot, just making sure, really, basically, mostly anticipation, just making sure I don't do anything without thinking about an anticipation to start it.
Anticipation really is one of those things that is going to give you a huge boost. As soon as you really start to get a solid idea of how it works, when to apply it, I think you'll really be amazed at what it can do for a scene and what it can do for a movement and how far it can take something from seeming robotic to feeling real. You know, anticipation, I think, is one of the more fun, one of the more interesting aspects of our art. It's one of the more obvious things to study, you know? If you watch a pitcher playing baseball, I mean, holy cow, his whole body is anticipation. You know, just study that guy. You know, go watch a golfer, his anticipation before he golfs, before he swings the club. You know, it's really interesting, and it's a lot more complex than you think. I mean, he really has to pay attention to how his feet move and where his toes are placed and where his weight is positioned and which arm is, you know, pulling the club and which arm is steering the club and how far is he going to anticipate and where are his eyes, and all these different things play into where that ball is going to end up going. If his feet are misplaced just a little bit, the ball isn't going to go to where he wants it to go to. You know, it's going to be wrong. It's going to be off. That's how people have hooks and slices and all these things. It's because there's so many different things happening in a golf swing, but it all comes together to create the golf swing. The same thing is true with animation. You know, you have all these different things to keep track of. Anticipation, squash and stretch, follow through, overlap, arcs, all these different things come together to create animation, and none of them are more important than the others. But just like with anything, if you're building a house, you know, you got to start somewhere. You got to start with something. And anticipation should be definitely one of the first things that you really study and really pay attention to. You know, it's important to learn, for example, when to use anticipation before when not to use anticipation. First you got to get a good solid grasp of how the basic mechanical function of it works, why it exists, why is it one of the principles of animation. It's because it exists in nature. It exists in everything that we do.
If you just notice, like before doing that trick, I actually went down before actually like doing the jump. That's really important in animation. We have to anticipate the move. There's different ways of anticipating a move, and there's different reasons why we do that. But on a very basic, level, physics-wise, I'm anticipating because I need to get some energy to do the trick. So, like, if I want to do a jump, I cannot just fly. I cannot just like. I have to like basically get some energy and then do the trick.
If I'm up on this thing, I cannot lift up my right hand without anticipating left first. If I do, I'm just going right down, right? But if I anticipate to the left a little bit first, I've got a little time to lift that up, right? If I come over here, it gives me a little bit of time. If I just barely go over that way, it gives me a really short amount of time. But if I go over to the left a lot, I can hold it up for a fair amount of time, right? That principle applies to everything that we do. Every movement that we take, every motion that we do, every action that we do. The less anticipation you have, the slower and the weaker the expected action. If you put just a little bit of anticipation, anybody watching that animation is going to automatically assume that a small movement is on the way, a small action is on the way, a small gesture is about to happen. If you put a great big anticipation, they're absolutely 100% expecting something really big to happen. A really big movement, or if you really do one of those big, whoop, boing, they're going to expect your character to take off like a rocket, right? Conversely, if I'm going to get up out of the chair, and let's say that my anticipation to get up out of the chair is just to kind of dip down just a little bit and rock forward, and I get to here, and maybe I do a little anticipation down and then up. That's a slow get up, right? A little bit down and then up. If my anticipation to get up is this, you're going to expect me to like
a big anticipation can be followed by an amazingly quick, almost unbelievable action. And a really slow, a small anticipation needs to be a slower action. When the coyote rears back and he goes back on one leg and he's there and he's there, and then poof, and then he's just gone, and it's not even a drawing, it's a line, and then followed by smoke. Well, if you had a character that zipped around like that, you wouldn't believe it, but the anticipation set up that action that was going on, so it made it believable. That anticipation is something that just kind of sets up an action and makes it seem real.
A really big anticipation and a really solid, big follow-through at the end of an action can sell a really fast action, really fast. You can have a punching animation, for example. The actual punch could be 2 frames, 3 frames. If you've got a really big wind-up and a really big follow-through, that'll work. You could even do a punch where the punch is 1 frame, and it'll be pretty cartoony, but the audience will get it. They'll know what happened. If you have a really big wind-up, and then this part is 1 frame, and then you have a really big, we'll totally know what happened. We'll know that it was a punch. And in that sense, that animation is successful. I don't necessarily think 1 frame would be the best way to go for a punch, but you could, and you could get away with it. And for a certain style of animation, it might work great. Anticipation really comes down to one thing, at its most basic level. And it's the second part of Newton's first law of motion, actually, where he says that an object at rest will tend to stay at rest unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. To me, those words, unbalanced force, that's the key phrase.
There's energy that's going to transfer, and this energy comes from somewhere. Say a human being comes from, say, the hips, right? On a walk. And well, to get the hips ready to move forward, they do something. They don't just start moving forward. It just doesn't work that way. And if it did, it looks mechanical. You can do that, but it doesn't look right. And it's because you're taking your balance off point balance, and you're falling, and then you're catching yourself from falling. But that transfer of taking, I mean, this is getting way technical, but like the transfer of going from, say, point balance, where you're standing just straight, to going forward, something happens to that energy. And that's where, like, the animation, like, to apply the principles of animation, you then apply an anticipation.
Human beings are pretty much as lazy as you could possibly be. We find the least difficult way to do almost any action. All of our movements are very refined and very specifically designed to save energy, to conserve energy.
The body's not dumb. It's going to take the easiest route, the most efficient route. Okay, so it just doesn't make physiological, biomechanical sense to do something that's going to take more energy than it should.
The least difficult way to do an action is to anticipate that action before doing it, because then you have the weight of your body helping you do that action. If I'm going to take a step to the right, it's really important that I know as an animator that most people, well, unless you're living on the moon or something where gravity is different, are going to anticipate left before they take that step to the right. Part of that is to free up that right foot to be able to come up off the ground. If the weight is still half on the right foot and the right foot comes up, that person's going down, right? They're going to fall. Nothing's holding them up anymore. But if they move, just scooch their butt over the left foot, that gives, the right foot room to move. It can come up. No more weight is on this foot, right? It can come up now.
Anytime you do something, any sort of locomotion needs to have a weight shift, or else you can't move.
The hips are like your center of weight right there, where everything comes from those hips, okay? And if the hips are to the left, that anticipation gives them somewhere to go to start this momentum to the right. So if you move left, put your right foot over to where it's going as your first step, and then you kind of let loose your hips to go back to where they want to go, which would be between the feet. Your hips are naturally going to want to keep on going, right? An object in motion tends to stay in motion, right? It's going to keep on going, and that's going to free up your left foot to come up and take that next step. And the keep on going part is what gives you this extra bit of inertia, this extra bit of force and energy that you don't have to put into your walk. It just happens because the weight is sort of falling that way. It wants to go that way anyway, right? And that it gives you this extra little bit of help with your walk, so that it isn't such a trying thing to walk around. You can just walk.
The amount of anticipation in a scene will directly affect, the cartooniness of that scene. If you've got tons of anticipations in there, or anticipations of the anticipations, or even sometimes the anticipation of the anticipation of the anticipation,
What am I doing?
that's going to be pretty cartoony. That's getting really wacky.
You got to go backward before you go forward. And for me, I even have like a little anticipation of an anticipation, where you go forward, you go back, and then you go forward. You got to be careful with that, because the more you do it, it might look a little silly.
The more anticipation you have, the wackier, the more cartoony it gets. And that's not bad necessarily. That's just a different style of animation. That's one style, right? That's kind of like Warner Brothers style. A lot of classic Warner Brothers stuff is anticipation-orama. Like giant wind-ups, and they do that big thing, and then they go. Well, giant again. That's how they did a lot of their work. It's these gigantic anticipations that is really fun and really entertaining and exciting to watch, and the way that they communicated with those, I think, is great. That's one style of animation. For me at ILM, we're not really doing that style very much. Our style is much more naturalistic, much more supposedly, hopefully realistic. We're trying to, get our characters to the level where they can act in the same space as the live-action characters. So, we can't be doing anything too crazy.
If you look at a realistic fight, there isn't too much anticipation, but it is there. It's more subtle, but it is there. And so I think that goes for squash and stretch and overlap and all those principles, and lead and follow through. You're going to find that in whatever you do.
Classic Warner Brothers stuff, it's the same way. It's the same technique. They're just ramping it up even further. They're exaggerating those principles and exaggerating those ideas even more than, a lot of the Pixar stuff right now, or, definitely more than we're doing at ILM.
If you look at boxers, for example, in a Warner Brothers cartoon, he might, take a huge, giant anticipation before he punches. He could take you know, a 10-second anticipation, and then you could have 2 frames of a big blur of a fist.
Some of the stuff that Pixar's been doing lately is a little bit more in between. You know, a lot of the motion has its roots in naturalism and its roots in, you know, the principles of what is going on in the real world, similar to Disney stuff. Then they're ramping it up and they're layering the principles of animation on top of that reference of what is happening around them in the real world. Take your stuff further than you think you should. Push things further, exaggerate things more, you know, exaggerate it as much as you think it should be and then double it, you know. Sometimes just go crazy and just exaggerate like mad and see, you know, what it looks like, because it's always much easier to dial that down and rein it back in and make that exaggeration of whatever it is less than it is to just incrementally do it a little more and then a little more and see what it looks like, and oh, maybe if I anticipate a little more and then a little more, and A, it takes forever, and B, it's really hard mechanically working with a 3-dimensional puppet to continually like push something just a little more and then readjust everything else to make it fit. It's so much better to just like really push something way further than you think it needs to be, and then you can just kind of bring everything back in if you need to. You know, if you do some, you know, giant, let's say on your bouncing ball, if you do some gigantic squash where the ball just like squashes out of the screen before it takes off, and you watch it and you're like, okay, that looks ridiculous, that's way too much. It's really easy to just take your curves and dial that squash down and dial it down the timing of when the ball happens, and then you have the anticipation that you want. You might as well just go for it, you know, just push it and go for it, and you're the artist, you know, just do it how you feel like it might work and then see what it looks like. And the first time you hit play, it's probably going to look pretty weird. And that's fine. It's the same for us. It's the same for us as professionals all the time. You know, all the time we'll do something and, you know, we'll hit play and it's like, oh, geez, good thing I didn't send, you know, that take to dailies without watching it, because there's a bunch of things wrong. And you go in and you kind of fix things and you dial something down or push something further. But the dialing down is easier than pushing it further. You need to be really careful not to overuse anticipation. For example, you never want to anticipate the anticipation of the anticipation of the anticipation. Be really careful of that, because it'll hose your scene, and you got to really watch out for doing too much anticipation. Over-anticipating can take all the life out of a scene, and you just get this really wiggly, super-duper 1000% cartoony look. If you're animating somebody up on these things and anticipate right and then left and then right and then left and then I lift up my right hand, it just looks silly. Nobody's going to do that.
Anticipation is hard. I mean, you really have to have, but if you think about it too much, you know, anticipation has its own anticipation, and I sometimes don't know how long or how much I have to go back, and then it would be too much. So, you know, you have to kind of see and then, you know, make it look right.
At the very most, maybe there's a really slight anticipation to the right, and then he goes left and then grabs. The wackier the style you're going for, the more you can push anticipation. The more you can anticipate the anticipation of the anticipation of the anticipation.
Can you do too much anticipation? I don't know. I always tell the animators to push it as far as you can, and I think as Richard Williams said, push it as far as you can. If you think you've gone far enough, push it further. That's what I keep telling the guys.
Exaggeration doesn't just necessarily mean going 110,000%, although I do that sometimes.
You know, I'll get a comment that it's like it's too big, it's too animated, or, you know, and then I'll pull back and I'll go so subtle that they're like, it's boring, you know? So finding that balance, I think, has to do with experience and developing your personal aesthetic and what exactly what works really well.
It's a good jumping off point for your animation. To push something as far as you can and even further, and then, you know, hit play, do a play blast, see what it looks like, and from there you can kind of move on and decide, oh, I need to dial that down, or, you know what, that still looks kind of cool. Maybe if I push it even further, it would have this really interesting look that I never would have thought of. It all depends on the style that you're going for and the situation that your character is in. Never feel like any of this is hard, fast, 100,000% concrete rules that you have to write down in a notebook and never ever waver from. You know, what we do is an art form, and what we do is It's liquid, it changes, it's art, it's not math. For the most part, you have a foundation that you stick by, and that foundation is like the safety net that's going to get you through every scene. If you stick with them, every scene will get done, and it'll probably look pretty good.
All your basics all hold true in 3D animation just as much as they did in 2D. You have to know it, or it's, you just don't get believable motion, I don't think.
Basics, man. You gotta learn the basics so we can talk to each other, we can have this constant language, and from that foundation, you can break them when you need to. Know when you're breaking them. Veer away. Know when they don't work or they don't apply. It's not that every rule applies at every frame, of an animation. It's just a language of understanding life. So learn them, then we'll break them.
The easiest way to get a grip on anticipation is to just get in there and play with it.
I was really lucky. I had a really cool group of friends that we would like go off and do a shot and then come back and be like, look what I did, and then we'd all talk about it. I think it's good to have peers that are learning with you, and you're learning things from each other. But it really, what's going to make you do better is just do a bunch of you got to do a bunch of shots, and then and don't worry, people, don't get so caught up on your first few that I got to make this one great. No one did great stuff when they first started.
There's all kinds of different anticipations. Find what you like. Find what speaks to you as an artist and what feels the most natural, or feels the most fun, or feels the most exciting, or whatever it is you're going for. At the end of the day, the way that you're really, really, really going to learn the most is to just take the things that you've learned, sponge it all, soak it all up into your head, and get down in front of your computer, in front of your piece of paper, or in front of your stop motion puppet, or whatever it is, and eventually you'll start to get the idea of how it works, and what works best for you, and what works best for certain styles.
Once you see it, as a done, okay, I did my first shot, look at, here it is, that's when you can start, critiquing it. But if you spend, a month working on your first shot, you'll never be able to, step back and learn from it. So if you just, don't worry about it and get some stuff out of you, and then that's where you'll really learn, I think.
Just get in there and play with it, and have tons of fun, and don't forget to check the assignment page and see what your assignment's going to be, and we'll be looking forward to seeing what you come up with.